If you read much of the Bible, you'll discover that not everything in it is suitable for children. Today's gospel lesson about the death of John the Baptist is a good example. Now, if you go upstairs in the Arnold House and visit the children's classrooms, or atria as they're called in Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, you won't find a lesson about this story with a tiny silver platter with a little tiny severed head on it. Yes, there is some R-rated content in the Bible, and that's because the Bible is not just the story of God, it's also the story of God's people in a fallen world. People do some despicable things. And that's the case in this fascinating and tragic story, one of the rare stories in the Gospels in which Jesus is not the main character. Another unusual feature of this story is the way it's told. Mark tells the story of the death of John the Baptist by flashing back as if we're remembering with King Herod what happened. As the scene begins, word has come to Herod of Jesus' powerful deeds, and Herod, known as Herod Antipas, who was the son of Herod the Great, that's the Herod we know from the story of the wise men and the birth of Jesus. He was the ruler of the region of Galilee where Jesus and the disciples lived. In his paranoia, Herod assumes that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead. Herod and John had an interesting relationship, it would seem. Mark tells us that Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and that he protected him. And then I love this sentence, when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. Herod had taken his brother's wife and married her, which was something of a scandal. Herod was a Jew, at least superficially, and John, assuming the role of the Old Testament prophet, criticizes Herod, saying that what he has done has violated the Jewish law. Now, if you know your Old Testament, you'll find a number of similarities in this story with the story of the prophet Elijah and his trouble with King Ahab and his infamous wife Jezebel. The difference is that things turned out better for Elijah than they do for poor John. It doesn't appear that Herod planned to punish John for his criticism, though. The trouble came from Herod's wife, Herodias. She didn't appreciate what John had to say, and she wanted him dead. So Herod had John arrested and put in prison, probably as a way to protect him. But Herodias gets her chance on Herod's birthday. After Herod's had a few goblets of wine, she has her daughter, who's called Salome in the other Gospels, dance for him. Her dance pleases the king and his guests so much that he makes a foolish oath, promising to give her anything she wants, up to half his kingdom. Well, after a quick consultation with Mom, she returns to the king and to his horror asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Now Herod has to choose whether to execute a righteous man or to look foolish in front of his guests by going back on his oath. He ends up choosing to save face with his friends. This story has stoked the imaginations of artists of all kinds over the centuries. But while it makes a great story, filled as it is with sensuality and intrigue and gruesome death, there's very little good news for us preachers to focus on. Except for the care that John's disciples show in burying his body, there's very little grace in this story. John was a righteous man who didn't deserve what was done to him by these wicked people. This is one of those stories in the Bible that makes us ask, why do bad things happen to good people? You may remember a best-selling book with a similar title from many years ago. People often think the title of the book was Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? When it was actually When Bad Things Happen to Good People. This thin but powerful book was written by a Jewish rabbi who lost his son to a rare disease. He wrote the book not as a theological treatise to defend God, but as a source of comfort for those experiencing grief. He writes as a father and a rabbi to address one of the most important questions that we ask as human beings, and one of the hardest questions to answer in a satisfying way. We all want to know how a powerful, loving God can allow the innocent to suffer. We all want to know why there is seemingly such an unequal distribution of suffering among us human beings. It seems unfair that some would be rewarded for doing the wrong thing while others would suffer for doing the right thing. Why do bad things happen to good people? There are a number of incomplete ways of answering this question, but there's not a simple answer. And I'm not sure a simple answer would really help anyway. I believe that part of why God put us on this earth is to wrestle with this question, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a way of finding meaning in life. I remember hearing a helpful lecture on this topic one time given by a priest and professor who's now dead named Wilton Bunch. He spoke to a gathering of clergy several years ago. And to illustrate the difficulty of dealing with this topic, he drew a triangle on a pad of paper. At the top of the triangle, he wrote, "God is all-powerful." Then, at one point of the triangle, he wrote, "God is all-loving." And at the third point of the triangle, he wrote, "Suffering is real." And finally, he said to us, that most of the approaches to answering the question of why the innocent suffer tend to emphasize two of the points and then minimize the third point. So if God is all-powerful and suffering is real, then God must not be very loving. Otherwise, God would do something to end our suffering. Or if God is all-loving and suffering is real, then God must not be powerful enough to prevent it. The third possibility is that God is all-powerful and all-loving, but that evil and suffering are actually an illusion. Personally, I've never been willing to give up on any of these 3 points. Even if I have to throw out logic, I have to affirm that God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, and yes, human beings really do suffer. The only way this makes sense is if we admit that we don't see the whole picture. We don't understand really what love and power and suffering are from God's perspective. Because we are not all-powerful, we are not all-loving, and we don't understand suffering with complete clarity either. We see through a mirror dimly, as St. Paul put it. We see pieces of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. But there are some pieces to the puzzle that we can figure out if we think about it long enough. We can begin with the fact that we know that we are finite creatures bound by time. We aren't meant to live forever in these bodies that grow old and die. We also don't have perfect vision. We don't see the world the way God sees the world. We can't step back far enough from our situation to judge it with clarity. And so we can't comprehend the complexity of creation because we're part of the creation. We also know that suffering has something to do with the gift of free will. But because our will is corrupted by sin, we tend to seek our own self-interest, even when it's not in the best interest of others. And so we make decisions that increase the suffering of others and ourselves. We also know that our suffering has something to do with the fact that this world is not a still life painting, but is in constant motion, constantly changing. There's an unfinished quality to the world. God is still creating new things, bringing new things into being. And change and growth mean the loss of what was, and that can be painful. Finally, we know that suffering has something to do with the fact that we exist in relationship with one another. When others suffer, we suffer with them. It reminds us that we are not separate individuals, individually pursuing our own plans. Our lives are interconnected. If there is a silver lining to the fact that we suffer, it's that suffering has a way of bringing us together. It reminds us that we need one another and that we are here to care for one another. Toward the end of the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Rabbi Kushner suggests that the bad things that happen to us don't have a built-in meaning, but it's up to us to make meaning out of them. He writes, "The question we should be asking is not, why did this happen to me? Or what did I do to deserve this? This really is an unanswerable, pointless question," he says. "A better question would be, now that this has happened to me, what am I going to do about it?" The only way I can make sense of how a loving and powerful God can allow suffering is when I realize that the suffering we experience in this world is somehow bound up with the love of God. This is a mystery that's represented most powerfully in the Christian symbol, the most famous of all Christian symbols, the cross. The cross reminds us that God is united with us in our suffering, and that God will redeem that suffering by bringing new life out of it. Though God doesn't afflict us directly to teach us lessons, God does allow us to grow spiritually through the things we suffer. God allows suffering to exist because God has a greater purpose in mind for our lives. Our painful experiences are the labor pains of a new life being born within us. So why does Mark include this dark story of the death of John the Baptist in his account of the good news of Jesus? It's part of the good news only in the sense that the death of John the Baptist opens the door for Jesus. Herod may have killed John's body, but even he can see that John's purpose is now embodied in Jesus in a new and more powerful way. God doesn't cause John's suffering and death, but God does redeem John's suffering and death in Jesus. John's death takes on new meaning in the life of Jesus, and in a similar way, the suffering and death of Jesus are given new meaning in the resurrected life of the Christian community. You and I can't undo the suffering of the past, but we can redeem that suffering by following Jesus, by imitating his example of faith, mercy, and forgiveness. May God grant us the grace to see in suffering an invitation to take up our cross and follow him. Amen.